Hi, my name is Chris Costa. I'm the town planner in Old Saybrook. And tonight we have the Connecticut Deep folks here to talk about the municipal coastal site plan application process and some changes online. We have invited some of our neighbors, so I do see some friends from Westbrook and Clinton and other towns, and I'm going to turn it over to Braden Lynn from Deep, who will be doing the Deep presentation. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. And it's only Monday. Introductions is, yeah, it's been a long Monday, so the Deep presentation and introductions.
Alrighty, so yep, my name is Braden Lynn. I'm an environmental analyst with the Connecticut Deep Land and Water Resources Division. I'm joined with by Mary Beth Hart, who is the supervising environmental analyst for our planning section. Jason Hale, who is one of our coastal planning analysts, and then also online we have Karen Michaels and Kristen O'Neill, two of our other analysts. I'm the coastal contact for Old Saybrook, and then a lot of the neighboring towns are represented by Jason, Kristen, and Karen as your coastal contacts. Fred Oliver, another analyst, will be here shortly. He's the coastal contact for some other neighboring towns, Clinton, Westbrook, and yeah, so we have a presentation on the coastal management process, coastal site plan review for zoning commissions and boards. A little bit of the presentation will go over how some of our referral requirements have changed with the recent public act that was passed last year. We did a more in-depth presentation on that, and I'm sure by now a lot of commissions are familiar, so we won't spend a ton of time on that, but I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. So starting off with the coastal management review process. Just an overview of what we're going to go over. We'll start with the legislative goals and policies of the Connecticut Coastal Management Act. Then we'll transition to the main considerations of coastal management. We'll go over coastal resources that the commission and boards and municipalities are tasked with protecting and preserving via the Coastal Management Act. Then we'll go through the municipal coastal management review process flow chart, which will cover what triggers coastal site plan reviews, what reviews are mandatory referrals to DEEP, a little bit about the public act and changes to those referral requirements, and then we'll go over adverse impacts. And then we'll look at some sample case studies, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. So starting off with the legislative goals and policies of the CCMA, and I just want to make sure this is recording, right?
Yeah, it is recording. Yes.
So the Connecticut Coastal Management Act outlines the key goals and policies which guide the municipal coastal management review process. Those goals and policies are to ensure that the development, preservation, or use of land and water resources of the coastal area proceeds in a manner consistent with the rights of private property owners and the capability of the land and water resources to support development, preservation, or use without significantly disrupting either the natural environment or sound economic growth, to preserve and enhance coastal resources, to give high priority and preference to uses and facilities which are dependent upon proximity to water or the shorelands immediately adjacent to marine and tidal waters. I've heard. To resolve conflicts between competing uses on the shorelands adjacent to marine and tidal waters by giving preference to uses that minimize adverse impacts on coastal resources and also provide long-term stability and economic benefits. To consider in the planning process the potential impact of sea level rise, coastal flooding, and erosion patterns on coastal development to minimize damage to and destruction of life and property, and minimize the necessity of public expenditure and shoreline armoring to protect future development. To encourage public access to the waters of Long Island Sound by the expansion, development, and effective utilization of state-owned facilities. To conduct, sponsor, and assist research in coastal matters to improve the database upon which coastal land and water use decisions are made. To coordinate the activities of public agencies to ensure that development proceeds in a manner that's consistent with the state plan of conservation and development. To coordinate the regulatory activities of public agencies at all levels of government to ensure maximum protection of coastal resources while minimizing conflicts and disruption to economic development. And to ensure that the state and the coastal municipalities provide adequate planning for facilities and resources which are in the national interest as defined in section 22A-93, and to ensure that any restrictions or exclusions of such facilities or uses are reasonable. Also, for the purposes of coastal management, referral of any application, as well as municipal decisions and findings directly to the municipality's Deep Land and Water Resources Division liaison, which would be myself for Old Saybrook, and then some of our other analysts for neighboring towns. That does constitute the statutory requirement for referral to the Commissioner of Energy and Environmental Protection, and it's actually preferred in the interest of expediency that the referrals go directly to us. So when you have referrals, if they're sent right to your coastal liaison, that expedites the process a little bit. And I'll pass it over to Mary Beth to talk about the main considerations of coastal management.
Thanks, Braden. Thank you again to Chris for inviting us down and for everybody who's here tonight attending this. We really do appreciate your interest, and you are kind of the first line of coastal management in the state, because the land use decisions that are made locally are up to you folks. And so we appreciate your interest and your efforts in implementing the Connecticut Coastal Management Act. There are three main considerations of coastal management in Connecticut. It's protecting coastal resources and water quality. It's properly managing coastal flood hazard areas. And it's prioritizing water dependent uses at waterfront sites. And the Coastal Management Act defines water dependent uses to be things like marinas and recreational boating facilities, but it also defines public access as a water dependent use. And so encouraging public access as maybe the sole water dependent use of an upland development is really important in the context of this third concept. With respect to coastal resources and coastal water quality, land use decisions are so heavily based on land disturbance and the things that can happen upland adjacent to a water body or adjacent to a resource like a tidal wetland. And so you folks are the first line of defense of those resources by adopting best management practices, for example, that address stormwater and make sure that stormwater is treated before it gets discharged, making sure that there's adequate space between a sensitive resource like a tidal wetland and land disturbance, so that secondary impacts from upland runoff or from soil erosion, that sort of thing, or direct encroachment into the resource itself. Those are other considerations, and a lot of zoning regulations have allowed for setbacks from sensitive resources to limit disturbance within that area adjacent to a sensitive resource. So avoiding and mitigating those kinds of resource impacts are really important. And then, of course, ensuring that development adheres to the state's water quality manual, which is just recently undergone an update to incorporate a lot of low impact development techniques, green infrastructure, making sure that there are things like rain gardens and other retention where you keep the rain on site for as long as it can, and then it gets filtered into the ground so that it gets treated before it gets discharged. Those are all things that affect coastal resources and water quality, and that's one of the first tenets of coastal management. The second has to do with managing coastal flood hazard areas. And the policy talks about making sure that flood hazard areas are managed in a way that hazards to life and property are minimized. And so building to FEMA standards is one way to do that with respect to property, but it doesn't really affect the life part of it if you're going to be increasing residential density in a flood hazard area. So one of the things that our office looks at when we're reviewing a zoning amendment, for example, to allow residential uses, there might be a zoning amendment that is allowing a residential increase, an increase in residential density in a zoning district that isn't in the coastal boundary. But it might also allow for increases in a district that is within the coastal boundary, even if it doesn't affect that particular project that's being proposed. And so we have to look at it from kind of the 30,000-foot view, where we want to make sure that we're not setting the stage for inappropriate multifamily development in flood hazard areas, especially if there's no opportunity for dry egress for evacuation or for first responders to get to properties. And we recognize that that might be at cross purposes with the housing issues that the state is experiencing. And we do recognize that, sometimes we come across as the bad guy because we'll say, that 150 unit, apartment building really isn't appropriate in a flood hazard area where there's no opportunity for dry access to the site. So those are the kinds of things that we look at when we're, reviewing things for managing flood hazard areas. And, these are just a couple of examples of Sandy and Irene and some of the impacts. I know Old Saybrook was hit pretty hard. I think some of these pictures might even be some Old Saybrook properties, but and neither of those storms was a hurricane. They were tropical storms. So even the force of a tropical storm was enough to do pretty substantial damage. And so we've got, standing water sometimes for several days, afterward, and no opportunity for, people to be evacuated out. And we've also noticed that people are really willing to leave their place of employment. If they have to evacuate, the office, they're ready to go. Leaving their home, not so much. And so we really need to make sure that they're safe, that there are ways for them to get out. And that's where that policy about minimizing hazards to life and property comes in. And then with respect to water dependent uses, giving highest priority and preference to water dependent uses at waterfront sites. And again, we'll look at things like zoning regulation amendments where maybe we're allowing, maybe there's a marine commercial district that doesn't allow for anything other than real bona fide water dependent uses like marinas and that sort of thing. And then there's a proposal for multifamily development, to allow that type of use in that zoning district. And, I know that we would probably take a really hard line on reviewing something like that and, discouraging that type of use to be allowed in the district, especially where none had existed prior. And again, the water dependent uses are defined by statute, and they are those types of uses that absolutely positively have to be located on the water because of their function. And public access is defined by statute as one of those water dependent uses. So are nuclear power plants. So, but your zoning can, address a lot of that. And I think it's important for municipalities to take advantage of the tools that they have with respect to planning for water dependent uses. Plans of conservation and development might incorporate what used to be called the MCP or the marine, what are those called? Marine commercial plans, marine coastal.
Municipal coastal.
Municipal. Thank you. That's how long ago it was that those were developed. And that was early on in the implementation of the coastal management program, where municipalities were really looking at their plans to specifically for the resources that were present in their towns, the types of uses that were present in their towns. And a lot of those things have kind of morphed over, 40 something years of coastal management implementation into plans of conservation development. And so, but there are some towns who will identify, we want public access along this particular stretch of a riverfront, for example. And then whenever one of those parcels comes up for redevelopment or something It happens where they come before a planning and zoning commission. You can look at your POCD and say, oh, yeah, we really want to get a walkway along the entirety of that waterfront. So, and it makes it that much easier to require that as a condition of coastal site plan approval if your planning documents are identifying that as a great area for public access. We also compiled the public access guide online. And we're in the process now of looking at ways to update that guide in the first place, we want to shift it to a better platform that's more user-friendly, that allows for example, translation of information that's on the website. Currently, they're just static PDFs that are very difficult to update. They're very difficult to translate into other languages. And so, but Braden's just brought up the guide itself. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to take a look at it, but what we're hoping to do is get it more interactive and more friendly, user-friendly, and also be able to identify things like public transit that might be available to get you to these spots so that you don't have to just drive. And to also kind of take a look statewide of where public access is kind of distributed and see where we can make improvements, where we can provide additional access, additional kinds of access if we, are sort of running short on car top kayak launches, for example. We can, kind of use that guide to help us identify all that. But all of these policies that municipalities are applying at the local level, we apply those at the state level as well. They're all the same policy. We apply those to federal projects when we're doing a federal consistency review. It's all the same policies. It's applied across the board at all levels of government that have responsibility for implementing coastal management.
So we'll turn it over to Fred.
Okay.
Would you prefer to look up there or down?
Let me see for me. Here's it.
All right.
Okay, so among the various coastal resources that are identified in the Connecticut coastal, well, I do this all the time, in the CCMA, are beaches and dunes. And so those are basically beach systems, including barrier beaches, spits, tumbelos, pocket beaches, a variety of beaches, as well as related dunes and sand flats. And these are dynamic areas that abut coastal waters, characterized by sand, gravel, or cobbles. And they provide nesting habitats for a variety of shorebirds and also habitats for various coastal plants and communities. They act as a buffer to flooding and erosion, and they dissipate wave energy. And they also provide recreational opportunities, including fishing, swimming, sunning, hiking, and sightseeing. The next one is the bluffs and escarpments. And so these are naturally eroding lands marked by dynamic escarpments or sea cliffs that have slope angles that constitute an intricate and dynamic balance between erosion, drainage, and degree of plant cover. And they are a sediment source for other coastal features. They also provide wildlife habitat, and they support various plant communities, and they help to reduce the impact of flooding by dissipating wave energy. And also they can provide recreational opportunities and scenic vistas. And so this is a graphic from our documents that just kind of show the various features. So the edge of the bluff, the slope, the toe, and the beach. And so you can see how those things all kind of fit in together. So coastal hazard areas that many of us, well, your town is one of them. Those are land areas that can be inundated during coastal storm events and subject to erosion induced by such events. So they include the flood hazard areas that are defined and determined by the National Flood Insurance Act, and determined by erosion hazard areas is determined by the Deep Commissioner. And so they include all the areas designated as A zones and B zones by FEMA. A zones are subject to still water flooding, including the 100-year or 1% annual chance of flood. And so during these particular floods, these zones may get 3 or more feet of waves, 3 or more feet tall, washing over them. And so these also encompass various other coastal resources. And they can also serve as flood storage areas where water can store there rather than washing over other things. And they provide a lot of open space and recreational opportunities. And so they are, by their nature, hazardous areas for structures, especially residential uses, because getting in and out of them can be very difficult, in part because the areas, the roadways that would lead to them are flood prone and likely to be underwater during and after a severe storm. So coastal hazard areas are defined in part by the limit of moderate wave action, LMWA line. And so that's shown on our FEMA flood maps. So that's the dividing line between zones with a wave height above and below 1.5 feet. And so the figure below shows a graphic of a coastal hazard area that shows the LMWA. So you have the V zone out where the waves are going to be of the greatest force and height. And then the coastal A zone, the AE zone around here. So 1.5 to 3 feet tall. And then the inland of the LMWA, wave heights up to about 1.5 feet.
And FEMA standards require that if you're within the LMWA, you're built to V zone standards.
And so coastal waters and estuarine embayments. And so these are parts of coastal waters around here that contain, that are made up of harbors, embayments, tidal rivers, streams, and creeks. And so they contain salinities of at least 500 parts per million under the low flow stream conditions. And they are typically separated into nearshore waters, offshore waters, and estuarine embayments. And so the nearshore waters are the waters and the land beneath them between mean high water and whatever depth the 10-meter contour would take you to. The offshore waters are basically waters beyond the 10-meter land contour. And estuarine embayments are protected bodies of water with an open connection to the sea, in which saline water is diluted by fresh water. So you have saline water coming in from Long Island Sound, for example, and fresh water coming down from tidal rivers, bays, and so on. And so this shows our various, shows an estuarine embayment. So you see the embayment with a river or some body of fresh water draining into it. And then the nearshore waters and the offshore waters with the boundary between them being the 10-meter contour. And so coastal waters, as you all probably know, are areas of high primary and secondary productivity. Lots of things live in there. They provide habitat for a wide variety of marine organisms. So for example, shellfish, finfish, crustaceans, and benthic creatures. And they support a wide variety of flora and fauna, spawning and breeding areas. They contribute to an important contributor to the productivity of neighboring coastal waters. And they also are, well, variously used to dilute out industrial, commercial, and residential wastes. And they support commercial and recreational fisheries, and they're important to transportation and navigation. And so related to the transportation and navigation, they provide recreational opportunities for boating, swimming, fishing, diving, and sightseeing. And the estuarine embayments are diluted by freshwater, areas of high biological productivity for organisms that have evolved in those environments. They provide significant habitats for shellfish, finfish, waterfowl, and They are also spawning and feeding grounds for a variety of commercially important fish. And they are corridors. Well, it's shad season now. They are corridors for essential for anadromous and catadromous fish.
One thing I will say is, in working on the Long Island Sound Blue Plan, which is a spatial plan for offshore waters, in Long Island Sound, I didn't realize this for all the years that I've worked at Deep, but we actually have cold water coral in Long Island Sound. So I was very impressed with that we actually have some cool organisms that are living right out there, but who knew?
You only know what you're looking for, right? You can only find what you're looking for. And so harbor areas have been highly engineered and developed, resulting in the functional impairment or alteration of their natural physiographic features or systems. And they are intensely developed, generally with bulkheads, seawalls, revetments, or other hard structures, typically constructed many years ago. And they have limited natural value, but they provide other types of benefits that we're probably pretty well aware of. So the economic benefits, their benefits as transportation and commercial centers, recreational boating, and they also have cultural and historic value. And so this shows some of our areas. So the inland shorelands where we would hope that houses and things like that are going to be built. And then this also shows over on the right-hand side, developed shoreline. So showing a revetment, marina, bulkheading, various things that hold the water back and make that type of development possible. And over on the left-hand side, you see what will be considered not a developed shorefront, even though it has some houses there, doesn't have the level of infrastructure that the developed shorefront has. So intertidal flats are gently sloping or flat areas located between high and low tides. So muddy, silty, fine sandy sediments, typically devoid of vegetation because of the dynamics and relatively little nutrients there. They're rich sources and reservoirs for nutrients, valuable feeding grounds for a variety of invertebrates, fish, and shorebirds. And they also serve as sinks for toxic materials where such materials can be sequestered into the sediments. So they're thereby cleaning the water to some extent. And they provide recreational opportunities, including shellfishing, fishing, and wildlife observation. And they do act as buffers for storm energy. So this shows intertidal flats at high and low tide. So kind of muddy, sandy, gritty areas at low tide, covered by water at high tide. Anybody from Westbrook online here? Oh, we've got Duck Island in there.
Yes.
And so we have islands, which are obviously land, well, except in Clinton, where they have a place they call an island. It's not an island. But they're land surrounded on all sides, nesting areas and critical habitat for shorebirds. And they support various floral and faunal species, some of which are not living on the mainland anymore. And they constitute a large portion of our undeveloped shoreline. And they also provide recreational opportunities, fishing, swimming, boating, wildlife observation. And they provide a storm buffer for the mainland areas. Rocky shorefronts, so bedrock, boulders, cobbles, because it's all stones, it's erosion resistant and typically not a major source of sediments. And they are, a rocky interface between land and water. And hard substrate and habitat for creatures that have evolved to live there. So barnacles, mussels, starfish, oyster drills, rockweed, and feeding grounds for shorebirds and finfish. And they dissipate and absorb wave energy, And unlike the sandier areas, they don't change a lot when they get hit by the waves. Shellfish concentration areas, so actual or potential or historic areas in which one or more species of shellfish are aggregated. Some provide harvest opportunities for our aquaculture industry or personal use, and well, provide habitat for shellfish, contribute to diversity of the benthic life forms, and they are sources of food for shorebirds, lobsters, and other marine creatures, as well as providing recreational shellfishing opportunities and economic opportunities. And so this map shows some of our shellfish areas along the coast. So town and state and recreational shellfish beds. So shorelands, moving inland a little bit, are land areas that are still within the coastal boundary, but they're outside of the coastal flood hazard areas. So because of that, they're not subjected to the dynamic coastal processes, and they have more upland geological features, so bedrock hills, till hills, drumlins. Outside of the coastal flood or erosion hazard areas, no tidal wetlands, beaches, dunes, or other sensitive resources. And they are sources of runoff that contribute to coastal drainage, as well as sources of sediments that help replenish our beaches and scenic vistas. As Mary Beth alluded to somewhat, they have high development and redevelopment potential. We'd rather have houses and other things built there than down on the water. And so this shows the statutorily defined coastal boundary, the FEMA defined flood hazard zone, and shorelands, tidal wetlands, and the water beyond them. And the submerged aquatic vegetation, so various vascular flowering plants that are permanently submerged in coastal, tidal, and navigable waters. Major species around here are eelgrass and widgeon grass, but those are among many other species of submerged vegetation as well, and they're extremely productive, like meadows of the sea, and they provide critical shelter for finfish and essential habitat for shellfish and especially scallops. And they take up nutrients, remove sediment, and reduce wave energy. So they're very good to have around. Tidal wetlands. So these are the borderlands. So they border or are on or beneath tidal waters. So for example, banks, bogs, salt marshes, swamps, meadows, and other lowlands that are within the tidal zone. Including areas that are now or once were connected to tidal waters. And so their surface is at or below 1 foot above extreme high water. And they are potential sites of growth for a variety of plant species that are statutorily defined in Connecticut.
So tidal wetlands are defined by those three things. They have to have the elevation, they have to have the connection, and they have to be able to sustain those plants that are listed in the statute. Inland wetlands, on the other hand, are defined by soil type. So tidal wetlands are defined by those three things. That all three things have to occur: elevation, vegetation, and the connection to the tidal flow.
And so many of these are in low energy environments, protected from direct wave action. And they are flooded by the tides twice a day, major sources of major habitats. And high nutrient and biological productivity, provide detritus that are at the base of food chains in the Long Island Sound. And they provide habitat testing and refuge areas for shorebirds and fish. And they help to stabilize shorelines although they have some resistance to storm impacts, as we see all over the Connecticut coast, they can drown if sea level rises faster than the sediment can accrete on them. And also seawalls and other structures can prevent their migration and result in them just drowning in place. Salinity is real important, which is one of the reasons why we're so big on stormwater management, because they need that salt water. A road, so tidal wetlands collect sediments and build, and so they help to protect the coast. So, that's the egrets.
All right, thank you, Fred. So that's an overview of our coastal resources. I'm going to go into the coastal management review process, which is where the boards and commissions of our state, our land use boards, come into play, protecting those coastal resources. So the process begins with the application being received by the municipality. Standard planning and zoning timelines begin at that point. I won't go into it here. I don't have to remind you all. I'm sure you're aware of the application timelines for planning and zoning.
Chris runs a tight ship.
Yeah.
She knows.
We try.
Once the application is received and those timelines begin, the commission begins its review at its meeting, starting with, is the project site within the coastal boundary? If the site is within the coastal boundary, which is defined in the CCMA as the area that is inclusive of coastal hazard areas, 1,000 feet setback from coastal waters, and whichever one of those two criteria is further inland. And that also includes tidal wetlands. It is available as a GIS map layer that you can find online. Applications on sites that occur landward of the coastal boundary, which is again that 1,000 feet inland setback, or coastal flood hazard or tidal wetland area that's connected to tidal action. Anything landward of that does not require a coastal site plan review. So if the project is not within the coastal boundary, there is no additional coastal management action required. If it is, the commission can move on in its review to, does the project include a change of zoning map or zoning regulations? Or is there a shoreline flood and erosion control structure? Or is a coastal site plan review required by statute? So starting off with the triggers for coastal site plan review, there's many different reasons why a site plan review can be required on an application. That includes any change of zoning map within the coastal area, any change of zoning regulations that may affect the coastal area, applications for activities or projects located fully or partially within the coastal boundary and landward of mean high water, which are not exempt from coastal site plan review. The CCMA outlines that a coastal site plan review is required for any application that is within the coastal boundary and landward of mean high water, whether fully or partially, which are site plans submitted to a zoning commission in accordance with CGS 22A-109, site plans submitted to a planning commission for subdivision or re-subdivision, and applications for special exemptions or special permits submitted to a planning commission, zoning commission, or zoning board of appeals, as well as applications for variances submitted to the zoning board of appeals that occur within the coastal boundary, and referrals of proposed municipal projects to a planning commission pursuant to CGS 8-24, which handles a lot of those regular commission referrals. There are exemptions that are outlined in the CCMA. Municipal zoning authorities can exempt these activities through their municipal zoning statutes. These are just the allowable exemptions. Not every municipality incorporates every exemption, but they do have the ability to through statute. Those exemptions include minor modifications to or additions to existing buildings, construction or modification of structures incidental to the enjoyment of residential property, including walks, terraces, fences, elevated decks, driveways, swimming pools, docks, and detached accessory buildings. fences, utility connections, walks, terraces, walls, essential service lines, or other minor structures which do not substantially alter the natural character of coastal resources or restrict access. That bold point does become very important, especially with things like fences and walls, in determining whether they are going to significantly alter the natural character of resources. Walls in particular is an area that can cause a lot of confusion, with the statutes being kind of difficult to interpret. So we'll cover a little bit more about those when we talk about shoreline flood and erosion control structures later in the presentation. Minor changes in use of a building or property, except those adjacent to or abutting coastal waters, can be exempted, as well as activities conducted for the specific purpose of conserving or preserving soil, vegetation, water, fish, shellfish, wildlife, or other coastal land and water resources. Interior modifications to buildings can be exempted, and previously there was a single-family residence exemption as long as the structure was not located on an island or within 100 feet of a sensitive coastal resource. But with the new legislation that was approved last year, that exemption was struck down. So single-family residences within the coastal boundary now require a coastal site plan review. That's only at the municipal level. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be referred to deep. So these changes took effect October 1st, and I'm sure the commissions have noticed this might create an uptick in coastal site plan reviews and work for something that was previously exempt and now requires a review. So moving along the flow chart here, if none of those items are included within the application, there's no zoning regulation or map changes, and a coastal site plan review is not required, then no additional management action is required. If any of those are true, you move on to, is a coastal site plan, or is the application complete? If it's not complete, you can advise the applicant of the materials needed to complete the application and continue when they come back with those materials. If it is a complete application, then you move on to determining if there's a zoning map or regulation change as part of the project. The zoning maps and regulation changes, the CCMA requires that both of those, as well as municipal plans of conservation and development, are submitted to DEEP at least 35 days prior to the commencement of a hearing. That requirement is contained in CGS 22A-104E. So those zoning map and regulation changes occurring within the coastal boundary, or which have the potential to affect coastal management, do need to be referred to us with at least 35 days of review time. So if there is a zoning map or regulation change as part of the application, you have that 35-day requirement. If not, you can move on to analyzing the site plans. Is there a shoreline flood and erosion control structure included within the application? So shoreline flood and erosion control structures, these are defined in CGS 22A-109C as a structure, any structure, the purpose or effect of which is to control flooding from or erosion from tidal, coastal, or navigable waters. This includes breakwaters, bulkheads, groins, jetties, revetments, riprap, seawalls, and the placement of concrete, rocks, or other significant barriers to the flow of floodwaters or the movement of sediments along the shoreline. That placement of concrete, rocks, or other barriers can include landscaping walls, things that are not necessarily built for the purpose of controlling floodwaters, but if they are going to have a significant effect of controlling floodwaters, then they can be considered shoreline flood and erosion control structures. That typically happens in FEMA flood hazard areas or close to coastal waters. So yeah, again, the purpose of the structure does not have to be flood and erosion control for it to be considered. A riprap preventment that is stabilizing a slope in a flood hazard area may have the effect of controlling floodwaters and erosion as well. Especially if part of the application includes placing fill behind these walls. You may have a 2 or 3 foot retaining wall with a significant amount of fill behind it that becomes a flood and erosion control structure because it's protecting that new fill from erosion or flooding from coastal waters. If you're ever in doubt, feel free to contact your Deep Elward planning staff for guidance. We're happy to review and offer guidance in situations where there is confusion. Again, since the statute is kind of up for interpretation, there is a lot of confusion here. Sometimes you'll have a retaining wall, and on the site plan, it's not expressly outlined to be controlling floodwaters, but you look closer and it's going to divert floodwaters onto a neighboring property or is holding back fill. So we're always happy to provide guidance on that if there's ever a question.
Well, and the fill can also play a part in that too, because the wall itself might not be problematic, but perhaps behind the wall was providing some sort of flood storage. And if you're placing fill, that flood storage goes away and you could have effects on neighboring property. So those are all the kinds of things that we have to consider and look at when we're taking the entire context of a wall into consideration.
Absolutely. So the CCMA requires that a copy of each coastal site plan that includes a shoreline flood erosion control structure is referred to the Commissioner of Deep within 15 days of its receipt by the Commission. And we again have that 35-day review timeline to provide comments and recommendations. The CCMA also states that shoreline flood erosion control structures should only be approved when the record demonstrates and the Commission can make specific written findings that the structure is necessary and unavoidable for the protection of infrastructural facilities, cemetery or burial grounds, water-dependent uses, or commercial and residential structures, and substantial appurtenances that are attached or integral thereto, constructed as of January 1st, 1995. So residential developments, especially new developments that are constructed that are proposed to be constructed, as well as a residence that was constructed after January 1st, 1995, are not eligible for shoreline flood and erosion control structures. In addition to that requirement, there also has to be no feasible and less environmentally damaging alternative, and all reasonable mitigation measures and techniques must be implemented to minimize adverse environmental impacts. So when you get a proposal for a structure like this, first, you have to review it and make sure that the structure that the shoreline flood and erosion control structure is being proposed to protect is necessary and unavoidable. The structure itself was built prior to January 1st, 1995, and both of those other criteria are met. The CCMA also requires that a copy of decisions on shoreline flood and erosion control structures are sent to the commissioner. And again, an email to your coastal liaison counts for that requirement. This is just a photo of some damage to a seawall. All shoreline flood and erosion control structures carry with them the possibility of damage. So the best way to avoid costly damage during storms is to avoid placing these structures wherever possible and the fill behind them. As we said earlier, Connecticut is overdue for hurricanes. Sandy and Irene caused a lot of damage to a lot of our coastal towns and our hard structures, and those were only tropical storms when they hit. We haven't had a Category 3 hurricane come through since 38 and 55 were the last times we saw those. So with our increasingly armored shoreline, there is a lot of potential for damage if another storm like that was to hit today. And these are just a couple other pictures of some Sandy and Irene damage to revetments and seawalls along the coast. Obviously, this one, the wall was completely taken down. So moving on in the timeline, once you have established if there is a shoreline flood and erosion control structure, that 35-day review requirement for DEEP is in place. Public Act 25-33 made some changes to referral requirements, as I talked a little bit about earlier with the single family exemption being removed. So this was passed last year and signed into law in June. The changes took effect October 1st. The changes are that single family residence exemption is gone, as well as it modifies 22A-109D to include two new referral requirements, one of which is any activity that is proposed within a FEMA V, VEA, AE, or LIMWA zone, and any site that contains tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes. So it's only activities that require a coastal site plan review that occur in these flood hazard areas that are mandatory referrals to us, as well as sites with tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes. So if the activity is exemptable, and it would be previously exempt from coastal site plan review under your municipal statutes or state regulations, it does not need to be referred to DEEP, and it does not need a coastal site plan review. If it's an exemptable activity. Single family residences, again, are not mandatory referrals to DEEP under the new Public Act. A coastal site plan application has to go before the commission, but it does not have to be forwarded to DEEP unless again, it's within 100 feet of those sensitive resources as the old requirement was in place, or if there are tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes on site, or if it occurs within a coastal flood hazard area. So although they're not mandatory, any coastal site plan review application can be voluntarily submitted to DEEP LWARD for review, comments, and guidance. So if you have an application that maybe doesn't meet the mandatory referral criteria, it's a residence that's outside of a flood hazard area, but you still would like our guidance, we're happy to review those. So with that new Public Act, if there are no shoreline flood and erosion control structures, then you determine is there a tidal wetland, beach, or dunes on site? If not, you can look for activity located within the FEMA flood hazard areas. If either one of those is present in the application, then that referral requirement now includes both of those. So again, that's any activity within the flood hazard zone or a site with tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes. And those will both have that same 35-day review requirement. So just a quick recap, mandatory referrals include any coastal site plan application with a shoreline flood erosion control structure, any coastal site plan application with activity in a flood hazard zone, any coastal site plan application with a site that contains tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes. It wouldn't matter if it's a residential development that's 200-300 feet away. If it's on site and it has sensitive resources, it's now a mandatory referral to DEEP LWARD. And then you have your zoning map and regulation changes, municipal coastal program plans, which are still unchanged, and plans of conservation and development. Mandatory referrals do not include exemptable activities. So if it was previously exempt, it's still exempt. This includes activities within a flood hazard zone. Again, if it's an exemptable activity, a change in use, or a minor addition to a structure that your zoning statutes allow exemptions for, it's still exempt. It's not, you don't have to refer us every single activity that comes before you that's in a flood hazard zone. It's only anything that rises to the need of a coastal site plan review. Activities within FEMA flood zone X, again, it's just the A and B zones that we're worried about. So as long as there's no other mandatory referral criteria, those areas are not required to be reviewed to us. And then applications for single family residences within the coastal boundary, but outside of those FEMA zones and with no sensitive resources on site. All right, so moving along, you can then proceed to the potential adverse impacts on coastal resources and future water dependent uses. So those adverse impacts are defined in the CCMA. There's 8 specifically, including degrading water quality through significant introduction into either coastal waters or groundwater supplies of suspended solids, nutrients, toxins, heavy metals, pathogens, or the significant alteration of temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, and salinity. There's degrading the existing circulation patterns of coastal waters through significant changes in the patterns of tidal exchange or flushing rates, freshwater input, existing basin characteristics, or channel contours being altered. You have degrading natural erosion patterns through the significant alteration of littoral transport of sediments in terms of deposition or source reduction. That's changing the erosion patterns along the coastline. There's degrading the natural or existing drainage patterns through significant alteration of groundwater flow and recharge or volume of runoff. There's increasing the hazard of coastal flooding through significant alteration of the shoreline configuration, bathymetry, particularly within high velocity flood zones. Those are your coastal A and B zones. There's degrading visual quality through significant alteration of the natural features of vistas and viewpoints. When the CCMA talks about visual quality, that's from the public trust area or publicly accessible areas. So that's not my neighbor put in a dock and it's affecting my view. It's only from the publicly accessible areas that visual quality is measured. And then degrading or destroying essential wildlife, finfish, or shellfish habitat through significant alteration of the composition, migration patterns, distribution, breeding, or other population characteristics of those species or their habitat. And then there is degrading tidal wetlands, beaches, dunes, rocky shorefronts, and bluffs and escarpments through the significant alteration of their natural characteristics for their function. The CCMA also includes adverse impacts on water-dependent uses and future development. Those adverse impacts include locating a non-water dependent use at a site that is physically suited for a water dependent use for which there is reasonable demand, or a site that has been identified for a water dependent use in your municipality's plan of conservation and development or in your zoning regulations. An example of this would be a waterfront site that's historically used and suitable for a marina development is instead used for a condominium or restaurant use. There's also the replacement of a water dependent use that does exist with a non-water dependent use. So an existing marina is replaced by a retail development would be an example of that. And then you have siting of a non-water dependent use, which would substantially reduce or inhibit existing public access to marine or tidal waters. So an example of this would be a waterfront residential development, maybe some condos or apartments that puts up fencing and signage, which is intended to discourage access to the public trust area where it was previously accessible. And that public trust area is waterward of the mean high water line. So if any of those potential adverse impacts do exist, you're going to move on in your review. If not, that is the point where the commission may approve, deny, modify, or condition the project. Any decision requires written findings, but if there's no adverse impacts, you just move on to the commission's review of whatever other aspects of the project there are. If there are adverse impacts, then the commission must deem those adverse impacts acceptable or not acceptable. So you look at have the adverse impacts been mitigated in an acceptable manner. The CCMA also outlines the municipal board of commission's responsibility in reviewing a coastal site plan to determine whether or not potential adverse impacts that have been discovered in its review are allowable and acceptable, or if they have a negative impact on coastal resources or future water dependent uses. So in determining the acceptability of potential adverse impacts, the commission must consider the characteristics of the site. That includes the location and condition of any coastal resources. Consider the potential effects, both beneficial and adverse, of the proposed activity on coastal resources and water dependent development opportunities. And follow all applicable coastal resources and use guidelines and policies as outlined in CGS section 22A-92, which is the overview of the Coastal Management Act, and identify conflicts between the proposed activity and any CCMA goal or policy. The board or commission may incorporate conditions or modifications of coastal site plan approval which mitigate these adverse impacts. For example, the board or commission may require a permanent deed restricted access easement for public access, including parking, seating, and signage to offset a non-water dependent development as a condition of the coastal site plan approval. They may require stormwater best management practices to be implemented to protect coastal water quality by retaining and treating stormwater runoff on site, especially in sites where tidal wetlands are present. Even clean water, even clean stormwater runoff that enters tidal wetlands has the potential to adversely impact them by diluting salt content. So that is one thing that the commission can require to offset that.
And one other thing that I'll mention about the water dependence and public access issue is that sometimes the developer will suggest that they will provide a public access walkway, which is fantastic. But it's really important for the commission to require that as a condition, because if they're just offering it, but there's no requirement for them to actually build it, provide the easement to do any of that. So it's really important that the commission actually require that as a condition of coastal site plan approval.
Yep. So if the adverse impacts are deemed unacceptable by the commission can require a modification of the project to mitigate those adverse impacts. That decision would require written findings. The commission can require a bond, escrow account, or other financial surety or security to secure compliance with those modifications. The commission or board may also condition a project with required changes to mitigate those adverse impacts. Those are subject to the same written findings requirements, and the commission can take the same bond, escrow account, or other financial sureties to secure compliance. If there is no condition or modification that would make it acceptable, the commission can deny a project without prejudice. The applicant can immediately resubmit that proposal with modifications that requires written findings as well. Or the commission or board may deny the project with prejudice, in which case the applicant cannot resubmit for a year. On the other hand, if the adverse impacts are deemed acceptable and all of the proper mitigation measures are put in place by the applicant, the commission can approve the project with written findings. And just a reminder, those written findings are required. Go into a little bit of information about those. So section 22A-106, the criteria and process for action on coastal site plans is what outlines that when the commission or board approves any activity on a coastal site plan, they shall make a written finding that the proposed activity with any conditions or modifications imposed by the board is consistent with all goals and policies of the CCMA, or incorporates as conditions or modifications all reasonable measures which would mitigate adverse impacts and secure compliance with the Coastal Management Act. And then in 22A-109, which outlines coastal site plans and their review, there's again, the shoreline flood and erosion control structure application shall be approved only if the record demonstrates and the commission makes specific written findings that such a structure is necessary and unavoidable for the protection of those facilities that we discussed earlier. And this is especially important for commissions, as specific written findings are much more legally defensible. So if you get caught up in an appeal or a court case, having those specific written findings about what the commission made as its determination are much more legally defensible.
That has come into play in a couple of cases where there have been affordable housing proposals where the burden switches. And so the commission has defensible written findings that a certain, that an affordable housing project may be denied based on coastal management considerations, flood hazard issues, for example, or unacceptable adverse impacts to resources. Those can help with your, defense if you are inevitably appealed on your decision.
And then just a quick overview of Harbor Management Commission referrals. So the Harbor Management Commission can request referrals of projects within the harbor management area, particularly those affecting sites on a harbor or adjacent to it. Referral requirements can be outlined in harbor management plans. So if the commission has asked or the harbor management plan dictates that a proposal should be reviewed and referred to them, they must be submitted to the Harbor Management Commission 35 days prior to any hearing or final decision. The harbor management reviews the submissions, whether it's a dock, pier, mooring request, for consistency with the town's harbor management plan, and will make its recommendation to the municipal land use body that has jurisdiction. So if a proposal is required to be reviewed by the Harbor Management Commission and the Harbor Management Commission finds the proposal inconsistent with the harbor management plan, 2/3 vote of the town board or commission is usually required to override that finding. And then specific referrals include some examples, proposals affecting real property or submitted to local, state, federal agencies that affect the harbor area. Specific applications for mooring, anchoring, or docking within the designated harbor management area, typically in coordination with the harbor master. And then local ordinance changes which affect the harbor management area are reviewed and recommended by the Harbor Management Commission to the Board of Selectmen. So just going to move through some sample case studies. We'll outline some of the changes and referral requirements, and then some just basic overviews of what the commission's looking for and what our comments might be in these situations. We'll start off with an application for a minor addition of a 200 square foot porch. The residence is within a FEMA flood hazard zone, AE 12. So prior to the Public Act that took effect last year, this application could be exempted from coastal site plan review under municipal regulations, as it is a minor addition to a structure. After the Public Act's passage, that hasn't changed. The application can still be exempted from coastal site plan review under municipal regulations, as it is a minor addition. Second, we'll go into a single-family residence that is located 400 feet from coastal waters. There's no tidal wetlands, beaches, or dunes on site, and no shoreline flood and erosion control structures. There is a FEMA AE 10 zone on site. It's 30 feet from the proposed development. So prior to the Public Act's passage, the coastal site plan review may not have been required, as the single-family residence exemption was in place. And this is over 100 feet from any sensitive resources. After the Public Act's passage, a coastal site plan review is now required at the commission level. That is not a mandatory referral to DEEP. In this case, there is a FEMA AE zone on site, but the activity that's proposed is outside of the flood zone, so it is not a mandatory referral. And just to contextualize that in a site plan, so if you have a proposed residence up there, and it's 400 feet away from these tidal wetlands down here, but you'll notice here the slope is going down towards those wetlands and the road empties there. So if they're proposing a new residence and maybe a new driveway, they have this rain garden upland which might connect the runoff from the house. Something that the commission should find in its review, or if this is referred to DEEP, we would also make similar suggestions, is just to be mindful of stormwater runoff leaving the site. In this case, perhaps a better location for a stormwater best management practice would be at the lower elevation of the site to catch some of that runoff from both the house and the driveway. This is going to prevent that runoff from leaving the site, running down the road, and emptying out into eventually these tidal wetlands that are those wetlands. That's still something that the commission can look for in these applications where the residence is further away from the coastal resources. Moving on, an application for a variance in order to construct an addition to a house within the coastal boundary on a site that contains tidal wetlands. So prior to Public Act 25-33, this would have required a coastal site plan review by the commission, as any variance application within the boundary does. After the Public Act, it requires that site plan review, and it is also now a mandatory referral to DEEP, as there is a tidal wetland on site, and any sites that contain tidal wetlands now must have their applications referred to us. So to visualize that, here you have your 25-foot tidal wetlands or coastal jurisdiction buffer. Perhaps they're proposing an addition that might encroach on that. That's a situation where the commission should find, and we would certainly offer comments that we would recommend against allowing a variance that allows encroachment onto a tidal wetlands buffer like that. You might have a case where the house is proposed further away, 150 feet, and that addition is not encroaching on tidal wetlands, so it looks like there's not any significant adverse impacts. But although there are tidal wetlands on site, the house is located substantially away from them, but it's still a mandatory referral to DEEP. And we might offer some minor comments in this situation, but Just again, to recap the new requirements, if there's a sensitive coastal resource, tidal wetlands, beaches, dunes on site, it's a mandatory referral now. Moving on to an application with a 5-foot high retaining wall that's within a FEMA AE 13 zone and is located 5 feet landward of tidal wetlands. The CCMA, again, as we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, does allow some walls to be exempted from coastal site plan review, and this can cause confusion when there's walls proposed. The important criteria is that it does not substantially alter the natural character of coastal resources, restrict access along the beach, or meet the criteria for a shoreline flood and erosion control structure. So in this case, you have a proposed retaining wall, which is in the flood hazard zone, abutting tidal wetlands, and will in effect control flooding and erosion and substantially alter the natural character of those wetlands. It does it in this case by preventing landward migration, which will eventually drown the wetlands as sea levels rise. So prior to the Public Act, this application would have required a coastal site plan review and a mandatory referral to DEEP with a shoreline flood and erosion control structure on site. After the Public Act, that hasn't changed. There's still that shoreline flood and erosion control referral requirement, but there's also the tidal wetlands on site, which is another mandatory referral requirement. So this is an example of a case where those new referral criteria might help us see applications that might have been missed earlier if there was confusion around what constitutes a shoreline flood and erosion control structure. So having those referral requirements for stuff in the flood hazard area and with those sensitive resources on site is like a second line of defense where earlier there might have been some confusion that caused some of those applications to be missed by us or by the commission. Just to visualize this one, so we'll say we have our retaining wall here, about 5 feet from a tidal wetland. They're proposing a pool and patio. So they're going to be placing fill behind this retaining wall. It's the residence itself is 25 feet from the tidal wetland, so it might meet the setback, but maybe this pool and patio is encroaching on a setback. This retaining wall is obviously going to prevent tidal wetland migration landward. So this is a case where referred to us as it would be under statute, we might propose that they relocate the pool and patio, incorporate a stormwater best management practice to retain runoff from the new development and keep everything away from the tidal wetland to make sure that those wetlands have land to migrate as sea levels rise. Next, we'll look at an application to create a public park at a waterfront site on a property that was purchased by the municipality. Maybe it was previously commercial property. There is a beach on site, so prior to the Public Act, it would have required a coastal site plan review before the commission, as it's a municipal project under CGS 8-24. It may not have required referral to DEEP, but now with the presence of a beach on site, the application requires a coastal site plan review before the commission and a referral to DEEP. Next, we have a proposed 4-building, 100-unit apartment complex located 120 feet from a beach. The beach is off-site. The development is partially located within the FEMA flood hazard zone AE 13. So this is a mandatory referral to DEEP because of the activity within the flood hazard zone. High-density residential uses should always be discouraged in flood hazard zones as they represent a significant increase to hazards to life and property, which is in conflict with the CCMA. Just to visualize this, let's say you have, so here we have the VE 15 zone along the beach. The beach is, again, 120 feet from the development. It's not on site. However, you have the road kind of sloping towards a street drainage. There's an eelgrass bed or a tidal wetland. These are things that the commission can always consider and should always consider in its review. Where is that stormwater runoff going to go? As well as where are the proposed buildings. So you have an AE 13 zone here. 2 of the buildings are within a flood zone. With a 100-unit development, you're talking 25 units per building here. So this is a case where we would recommend in comments, and the commission would hopefully also recommend and condition or modify the application to pull those residential buildings outside of the flood zone. They can remain on site. Within the flood zone, that's a good opportunity for stormwater best management practices, as well as locating the proposed parking there. And then these BMPs can be incorporated, and we would recommend that they be incorporated, especially with those eelgrass beds off-site that can be very sensitive to stormwater runoff, especially from hot asphalt and roofs and new buildings and stuff. So we'd recommend rain gardens or stormwater detainment on site to manage that runoff. Next, we'll look at a zoning text amendment application to permit accessory development units within, we'll say the municipality has residential R1 and R2 zones. This is a mandatory referral to deep as it's a zoning amendment that will affect the coastal area. And even if there are zoning amendments that don't directly seem to affect the coastal area, we still, anything that has any potential to affect the coastal management zoning requirements, we will look at. So let's say that this is the example text. You have your developable land area table up there, the R1 and R2 zones. You have outlined all of the policies that would affect an ADU, the owner having to be an occupant of the property as a reasonable accommodation for family members, lot area requirements, any zoning requirements that would normally be incorporated. So we'll review these, and in this case, we might notice that part of the R1 and R2 zones are located within a flood hazard area. So allowing an accessory development unit on these sites may increase residential density. This is a case where it's not a clear 200 unit apartment building, but over time, if ADUs are allowed in the flood zone and one person gets them, their neighbor gets them, up the road gets them, and eventually you have 20 or 30% more density in the residential area. So we might recommend in this situation that a stipulation is added that an ADU shall not be permitted within a FEMA flood hazard zone. And I believe it was Old Saybrook that did this recently with you had accessory development units, which were allowable in buildings, I believe that were constructed prior to 1944. And there was a stipulation in there that they had to be outside the flood hazard zone and away from coastal resources, which was a fantastic incorporation for those.
Well done.
Yep. Moving on to a zoning map amendment that would change the designation of a waterfront site from marine commercial to a mixed-use business area. This is a mandatory referral as it's a zoning map amendment within the coastal boundary. So contextualizing this, you have an existing marina, and then they're proposing this mixed-use residential and retail development. So this is a site that maybe historically supported a water-dependent use or has the potential to. This is a rather clear-cut situation where our comments and the commission's review should probably be pretty strict with this and say, hey, this is a waterfront site. This is outlined as supportive of a water-dependent use. So if there is going to be a development at the site, it should give priority to those water-dependent uses. So changing the zoning designation to a mixed-use designation that will allow for residential development within the flood hazard area. You have this AE13 zone. That's something that might be in conflict with the Connecticut Coastal Management Act and has the potential to increase residential density, and that would increase hazards to life and property. So we might recommend against that. But you might have a case where they're rezoning, say, from marine industrial to a planned development district, and the development will allow for a mixed-use development at the site that was previously used as a marina. Still a mandatory referral, but in this case, you have your existing conditions here where there's maybe an old marina that's not being used anymore. The site's being used for boat storage, and say a developer comes in and wants to convert those buildings to maybe a restaurant, a retail building, some residential uses outside the flood hazard area here, maybe a park and open space. This is a situation where the commission might review and say, hey, this used to support a marina. You're proposing a development district here that allows for mixed uses, but takes away the water dependent use potential on the property. So the commission can implement some conditions or ask for some deed restricted public access. So a public access walkway, public access to the dock, that can create like a waterfront area that has significant public access, which is an acceptable water dependent use as far as the CCMA is concerned. So as long as there's no concern with residential development, this is a development that the commission might look at and say, it's changing the zoning designation, but it's deed restricted public access. Public access is a water dependent use, so we find that this is acceptable and consistent with your town's conservation and development plan. So,
Well, and I think that's an important key too, is that if your POCD is identifying these sites for that type of development, that's really helpful in the context of when you get a proposal. If it doesn't have the key components in it that your plan of conservation development suggests that it should have, then it's that much easier for you to put that forward, because POCD is gonna manage expectations of developers. And it's gonna tell them exactly what you want and what you envision for your waterfront areas. And even the previous example with the proposed residential use and retail development. If you get rid of the residential component of that, because it's again increasing hazards in a flood hazard area, but a retail development could be acceptable if you have a public access component to that. And it's really important to understand that the public access is the water dependent use. It's not just sort of we'll throw in public access. That is the water dependent use, and it should be treated as adequate parking, adequate signage, adequate opportunities for people to use it. Because it is the water dependent use of the site. So, and those are all important things that the commission can require as a condition of the site plan approvals. And if your POCD is really, identifying that as what you guys want to see, it makes it that much easier.
Yep, absolutely. So in a case like this, say they're proposing this without any public access and they just want a zoning map amendment to allow for a residential development here. This is a clear situation where we would say to the commission, hey, we don't think this is consistent with the CCMA. We would recommend you deny the application. But then an application like this is one where not only are there acceptable water dependent uses being proposed, but this is a proposal where we're going to defer to the commission and say, hey, this is your area. The site characteristics better than we do. So if you think it's appropriate to change the zoning designation and you're securing public access, that's up to the commission to determine whether it's consistent with again your plan of conservation development. But the municipalities are going to know their towns better. So if they think it's an acceptable change of use for the site, given the site characteristics, previous and current uses of the site, then that's something where we would make comments and say, hey, this is your area, this is your town. If you think this is acceptable, we like the public access. So that's a case where we would kind of just defer to your judgment, as long as things on our end look consistent with the CCMA. So that is what I have for case studies. So we can move on to some time for questions and answers. And if there's any online, they can also put those in the chat, I assume, right?
I don't think so, because it's a webinar, so they have to
Oh,
raise their hand.
Yeah, so, well,
One thing that might be helpful is to explain a little bit about the role of coastal site plan and a variance or coastal site plan. So I think a lot of people think they're different applications. Is that something you could,
Yes.
so can you approve a variance but deny the coastal site plan? What happens there?
Well, no, because the coastal site plan is the variance application. And the Coastal Management Act defines each of those things, like Braden was saying, if it rises to the level of needing coastal site plan review, It's either an application before the zoning commission, the planning and zoning commission for zoning compliance. It's an application for subdivision or re-subdivision. It's an application for variance before the ZBA or special exception, special permit. It's an application for municipal improvements under 8-24. So if it's that underlying application form, whatever is required, the coastal site plan review is just kind of tucked into that. And it means that you're not only looking at each of those things for compliance with your zoning regulations or whether there's a hardship with respect to a variance. You're also looking at it from the perspective of how does it affect coastal resources, including coastal water quality? How does it manage coastal flood hazard areas? And how does it give priority and preference to water dependent uses at waterfront sites? And so if a variance, for example, is asking to minimize a setback from tidal wetlands, if a municipality has a setback in the zoning regulations and there's a proposal to vary that. Sometimes we've seen applications where there's a 50-foot setback in the zoning regs and they're requesting encroachment to like within 25 feet. Sometimes that can be acceptable. I mean, in some towns, we're lucky if we get 25 feet of a setback from tidal wetlands. And it depends on the activity. It depends on, the amount of site disturbance that, goes along with that development proposal. So the variance is really just setting the stage for that development to occur. If you grant the variance, then it goes for zoning review, which also requires a coastal site plan review. And that's where, all the details get worked out. How are you going to construct? Are there soil erosion and sediment controls? And a lot of times our comments will say, if a variance is approved, we recommend that the applicant incorporate these things into the subsequent zoning compliance coastal site plan application. But the variance is its own thing. And it's looking at how the requested varying of those zoning regulations, how is that going to set up future development? And is that going to have an effect on coastal resources or flood hazard area management?
I asked the question because I think a lot of times everyone thinks it's, the site plan and the CAM, or so
Yes,
they're
right.
spread apart, but they're really one. So
Yes.
one can sync the other. That
Yes, yep. And it's really just the additional review of those coastal management policies, in addition to looking at it from, whether it complies with your zoning, requirements.
That's not to say, we might have a variance review where we're looking at a variance and we say, oh, like, this appears acceptable with the CCMA. That doesn't mean, like, when it moves to planning and zoning, that's not, oh, Deep said it was fine, so whatever they're proposing is fine. It's the variance sets the stage. We've said, yes, the variance is acceptable, but you still have to go through that whole review process and make sure that from the planning and zoning commission's standpoint, everything is being addressed as far as adverse impacts and coastal resources. So
Right.
the ZBA may look at something and be like, oh, it's a little bit of an encroachment, but it appears acceptable. And then you get into the nitty gritty with planning and zoning and you see like, oh, there's a lot of stormwater runoff with this. So the actual proposal is not acceptable in the way that they're proposing it. And we need to condition it or make sure that they're managing stormwater. But so they kind of work in tandem for each other, but it's like Mary Beth said, the zoning sets the stage for planning and the board of, or the variance, sets the stage for what's going to happen in terms of the development plan at the site. But they do kind of work in tandem that way.
So are there any suggestions that it doesn't go for a variance? So, for example, some of the houses that are no longer exempt, they'll go to the ZBA for a variance for their coastal site plan, and then it's an administrative site plan or sign off. Is there any, thought or suggestions when a ZBA or there's is looking at a plan that, that they should take into consideration? I mean, maybe it'll go through flood review and whatever else at a later stage, but little tips or thoughts?
So technically, there's no administrative review for coastal site plans. So if it rises to the level of needing a coastal site plan application, because it needs to go before zoning for zoning compliance, planning for subdivision, ZBA for variance, special permits, special exceptions, municipal improvements, if it's not exempt from coastal site plan review, and it's not, for example, one of those minor additions or, that sort of thing, and it rises to the level of needing coastal site plan review, then it has to go through a full-blown commission or board review.
So the
There's not,
ZBA can't do that during their,
no, there's no. So what you're saying is that someone would go to ZBA to vary,
a sideline setback for something
okay,
and say it was within 100 feet, they would conduct the coastal
It's like
site
say
plan.
like elevating a house is what
right,
comes up.
but wouldn't they then need to go to planning and
Not
zoning?
in all circumstances. So that was, I think, something we talked in the beginning. So what are tips? Not for like for ZBAs, not just say, oh, it's gonna go to planning and zoning later. Are there
Mhm.
any tips in general to give, in the event it doesn't go?
Well, I suppose if it's something that's minor enough where it really is just a side yard setback and it's not a main. If it's something small enough like that and it doesn't have to go to planning and zoning, then perhaps maybe I'm being naive, but it wouldn't necessarily have significant adverse impacts on a coastal resource, for example. Because if it would have significant coastal effects, wouldn't that then trigger coastal site plan review before the zoning commission?
Like, I guess it's sometimes kind of teaching members what those significant impacts are.
Mhm.
And some things, and you try to have the explanation of, well, somebody's putting an addition on their house and they're on a hill, but their driveway's asphalt and their car leaks oil and the wetlands sound like those types
Right.
of small things to kind of put it in perspective. But I think sometimes when you have reviewers or volunteers looking at some of this stuff, it's kind of like,
Mhm.
well, what do I say? Is it really gonna take out that dune? Is it, they're putting an addition on? Things like that, I think could be helpful.
Yeah, I think, especially with zoning board of appeals, just being mindful of, like, say you have a house that's being elevated and all they need is really a side yard setback, but then they're also putting on a huge addition and there's no stormwater proposed. That's something where, they absolutely in that case could comment on that and say like, well, you're granting the variance to set the stage for development that doesn't look consistent. So you can deny the variance in that case and say like, oh, like it looks like this development isn't going to be consistent. It's going to have adverse impacts on a tidal wetland or something. So I guess for ZBA members, just kind of practicing like you're not always given the full in-depth site plan that planning and zoning would be, but looking for those basics. How close is it to a sensitive coastal resource like that? Where's the stormwater going? What are the basics of the proposal? So they may be eligible for a side yard setback to raise the house, but if they're raising the house in tandem with an addition or something's being missed in terms of like the adverse impacts, the commission could absolutely comment and say, hey, we're worried about this. And especially when it's a quantifiable thing like stormwater, say like, oh, you're increasing the lot area or the coverage area and there's no stormwater mitigation. That's a direct adverse impact that's quantifiable, and the commission can say, or the board can say, hey, well, this development doesn't look like it's going to be consistent. So
Well, and I think the other saving grace here is the new requirements for referral to deep. Because if the activity is occurring within the flood hazard area, or the variance is going to affect, because they have to vary front yard or side yard setback, because the development is going to encroach into a flood hazard area, or if there are sensitive resources on site, tidal wetlands, beaches, dunes, those are automatic mandatory referrals to us. And so if for example, that it's not going to go before planning and zoning, you can talk to Braden about it when the ZBA variance application gets referred to us.
So, and that's kind of, I know Braden's been great in response, but you go through and it could be, variance of the tidal wetland setback, instead of 50 feet in Old Saybrook, it goes to 10 feet.
Mhm.
You know, but then it goes, say it does go to the zoning commission, the zoning commission's kind of stuck too, well, they already got a sideline or tidal wetland variance. They're stuck there, so I mean, I thought it was kind of each point to kind of hammer away, because if you give the variance, then you're kind of setting the zoning commission up.
Yes, right,
That they can't do anything about it because it's locked in place.
right.
It's tricky.
That's where I'd say the planning and zoning commission, well, they can absolutely consider the variance was granted and the reasons why the variance was granted. Ultimately, if they don't think that the development is consistent with the CCMA, if they think if this is gonna adversely impact the tidal wetlands, they still do have the ability to condition, modify, deny, or approve. So I guess even though the variance was granted, once that full site plan comes before them, they still do have the statutory authority to say, like, you need to change this, you need to make sure that this runoff is contained, or implement best management practice. So definitely, I would encourage them to consider the ZBA's review and why they determined the variance was acceptable, but they still have their statutory authority to make those same determinations. And it can put kind of the boards and towns, I mean, the boards and the commissions at conflict with each other at times. And I mean, I've noticed I have some towns that they work very well and there's a lot of communication, and then other towns that they're kind of on different agendas, and it can create some confusion when you have, like, say, a ZBA that wants to approve everything and a planning and zoning commission that wants to be really strict, or vice versa. So yeah, it definitely. I think just as much, I know they're volunteers, but as much education as they're willing to give themselves, just kind of monitor planning and zoning, see what, maybe if you're a zoning board of appeal member, attend a couple planning and zoning commission meetings, or just keep track of their reviews and how they do it. And wherever there's opportunities for communications, I guess, between the town and the commissions, to make sure everybody is as educated as possible and on the same page. And I think we hope to do some more municipal training, kind of focused specifically on, say, stormwater or more specific targeted trainings in the future too. So hopefully we'll be able to roll some of those out.
That would be great.
The kind of thing you just talked about, Braden, I'm on ZBA in my town. And in our case, the zoning official, the town zoning official, he serves as that kind of conduit for information. He'll give us information about what's going to happen if we approve it or if we don't. So that the town zoning official serves as our kind of teacher and communicator between us and the planning and zoning.
Yeah, it's the same. I'm on my town's wetland commission, and it's the same with us. Our wetland enforcement officer is very knowledgeable and helpful with the commission too, and as I'm sure you are with your commissions. And so it's always helpful to just keep a direct line of communication and be receptive to the municipal staff and the other commissions.
But that does raise an interesting conundrum.
Oh yeah, it can be complicated.
Yeah,
Especially if commissions and boards disagree on how to handle some of these sites. I mean, I've seen it with, even in my town, the planning and zoning commission might be adamantly against something that from a wetlands perspective we shouldn't have a problem with. So you'll get people showing up to our meetings saying, I don't want this in my backyard. Well, we're a wetlands agency. We're not a land use commission. So
Any questions online?
So
Wanna raise your hand or?
saw some allowed to talk coming up.
Oh, no,
from- That's not that.
yep, feel free to raise your hand if there's any questions, or if anybody in the room yet.
Yeah, you talked a lot about, speaking of storm runoff waters, is there any protocol for, like, a house built right on the water for chemicals on their lawn, pesticides?
actually, there have been some commissions that have tried to address that through conditions of coastal site plan review. I don't know how enforceable it is from a zoning enforcement standpoint. But there are some folks through the Long Island Sound study that's now called the Long Island Sound Partnership that can work with property owners and, try to get behavior change with respect to placing chemicals and fertilizers and making sure that they're appropriately applied. So I could get information, for you with respect to some of the folks who've done some outreach campaigns.
We do some within the towns for conservation and water pollution control as well, but it's hard to enforce.
Yeah,
Quick question, how do you look at when you change, or when FEMA changes their zones, which they do regularly?
Mhm.
So you approve a project that's not in a flood zone, and lo and behold, a week later, a month later, it's in a flood zone. How do you guys manage through that process?
well, at that point, the review's already been done, and it has to be based on the mapping that is in effect when the application is, received and reviewed. I think that the flood maps probably are more of a flood insurance requirement at that point. So if the FEMA maps change and you find yourself in a FEMA flood hazard area, after the fact, I think that affects whether or not you need to get flood insurance.
So follow through that for the next, they want to make an adjustment to the plan. Would you then apply the original map that was applied at the original application? Let's say they wanted to do an add-on or something different, or would you now apply the map at the point in time for that adjustment?
So if they're making an improvement to the house after the change in mapping, then it's the mapping that's in effect when they apply for that change. So, and then that also factors in, substantial improvement and whether or not it meets the threshold, whether or not if it's connected to the existing structure, whether that structure has to be brought into FEMA compliance.
Are you
So-
talking an adjustment, like they got their approval, they're still building the house and they need to change
Right.
something and come back, or do you mean like an addition
Right.
down the road? So
Right.
I think with an adjustment to the application, correct me if I'm wrong, if it's just a minor modification to an existing approval, then they can go based on that, the date, whatever the regulations were at the date of approval.
No, it's the date the regulations in effect. So you can
So
build
if
a
it's
flood
new,
compliant
yeah.
house.
Yeah.
The flood compliant house, say it was the 2008 map, the map changes in 2013. Your flood compliant house in 2008 is subject to the 2013, the 50% rule goes into play.
Right,
So it's like you're not compliant, even though you get credit for being compliant. So like what we did in 2008, we added 1 foot or 2 feet of freeboard, I forget when it was, and people were very upset. And then they found out, oh, well, wait a minute. When the maps changed, they said, you guys kind of saved us, because then the 50% rule would have come into play.
Mhm.
Because we saved them from the change in the elevation. Whether that happens this time
right,
and the upcoming changes, who knows?
yeah,
Yeah, so one thing I do in my comments, and I would encourage the commissions to do too, if you have a development that's right on that flood line, I always try to highlight that those flood zones aren't just walls, that storms can be stronger than anticipated, and those flood maps change over time. So if say you have an applicant who's right on the edge of a V zone or right on the edge of a Limwa area, and they're raising their house 1 foot to be compliant, or I mean, not directly 1 foot, but they're raising their house to that 1 foot above the elevation for that zone, that's an opportunity to say, like, have you considered going higher? Because flood maps are going to change over time, and if you need to do substantial improvements down the line, if you elevate 3 feet now, then you're protected. Even if that V zone encroaches onto the house, you're compliant with that V zone. So that's something like on those borderline applications where it's right up against the flood zone. I just try and remind commissions and applicants like, hey, if you're elevating now, you might as well consider going a little higher, because these flood zones are going to change over time.
And it impacts the insurance. We had someone who cut a section of their house off to get out of the flood zone because the line shifted in their yard. But I mean, it's, not that the water's gonna stop at the line.
Right,
yeah.
For
Right.
insurance purposes.
Right.
you're supposed to stop, yeah,
Water doesn't know the
Right,
regulations.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. When you talk about public access to the water areas, what is your definition? Does that mean you have to get to the water? You have the ability to view the water, just view it?
it depends on the characteristics of the site. I know that there's, some areas that are, bluffs. And so you don't want people, running down the face of the bluff to get to the beach. So scenic overlooks and walkways at the top of the bluff, you know, to take in the view it's perfectly fine. There are some areas where you can actually get to the water and into the water. And so it might make sense to have, you know, a top boat launch incorporated into a project, that sort of thing. But it really depends on the characteristics of the site and there also is, there's a statute, and I don't remember the reference to it, but there is a statute that limits liability for people who provide public access on private property, that they can't be sued, you know, if there's an incident. So because that was a big thing early on in providing public access, that a lot of people, private property owners were concerned about that, which is understandable. So that it waives liability.
And that's one area where the commissions do have a kind of discretion. If you have like to go back to that example where they wanted to make a planned development district on a site that was previously marine industrial. You could have a situation where you, like, the initial application comes in and they're proposing a little path that goes up to a bench and you say, well, this isn't a significant public access. This isn't enough public access to mitigate those adverse impacts to future water dependent uses, where you're taking away a whole site that maybe was suitable for a marina and putting a bench there. So that's where the commission can say, like, okay, look, this could be acceptable with public access, but we're going to need more than a bench. You're going to have to provide signage, parking. If it's a place where it would be suitable for a kayak launch, that would be a great thing to ask the applicant to include and secure. Because you're looking at kind of in the future, if you're taking away a use at a site that's water dependent, you want to replace it with another water dependent use, which public access can be. But you want to make sure you're mitigating those adverse impacts so that you're getting a significant public access at the site in exchange for that trade-off where it's no longer going to host a marina or something.
Anyone else?
Any other questions? Yeah, that'd be a good thing to, like, kind of get more into the specific public access training, some education on, especially the liability issues, because I do hear that a lot. I've done site visits at sites in this part of the state that are looking to do some development in public access, and I hear some concerns about liability and stuff. So definitely getting some of that information out there better so that commissions and the public themselves can be more knowledgeable on liability and stuff to encourage them to want to provide more. It would be great.
Well, we now have a National Estuarine Research Reserve based at Avery Point. And I know that they're very interested in scheduling more hands-on municipal trainings. So that would be one of the things we would probably look to them to try to maybe have a charrette type of thing where we can have commissioners come in and sort of work on designing public access and, you know, the types of things that we would look for, and maybe have some speakers come in and talk about that. So we'll definitely let you all know and coordinate on that.
Definitely like be interested in that.
Great.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
That's great.
Thanks for your interest.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.